So if you've seen my channel before, you know that I love finding weird ways to juggle, and this is one of my favorites because not only is it weird, but it also has a ton of potential to be much more than just a weird thing. And personally, I think that it's something that every juggler should learn at some point. So let's jump into how you get started with this. First thing I've got to mention is that this is not a regular tennis ball. So it doesn't bounce. You have to fill it with something so that it's a little bit less bouncy and a little bit heavier than a regular tennis ball, so that this is a little bit easier to use. Now, a lot of people will use sand. That's what I was told to do when I first started with this. I chose not to use sand because then you run the risk of there being a sand leak at some point, then you get sand all up and everything, and I don't think that's worth that risk. So, where did I put? Oh. I used these, which are literal copper BBs for like airsoft stuff. And the advantage to these is that they're not going to come out as easily, and if they do, it's not that big of a deal. So I would recommend, they're very noisy though. I would recommend these. And what I did was cut a little hole into the tennis ball, and you can barely see it because I used a very small hole. And I personally pushed them in one at a time, which was a very lengthy process. But what that meant was that the hole was small enough that I didn't need to glue it back up. Now, you can just glue the hole and it should hold up just fine. I don't know why I went over the top. It's not that big of a deal. The other thing worth mentioning with this is that I specifically weighed this out so that I had the amount of BBs in there that would make that equal to the weight of one of my standard beanbags. So that way I can kind of use these things interchangeably and it doesn't feel any different, which is nice. Now before we get into any actual juggling, there's a couple of quick things you'll need to know. First of all, you can control whether or not you toss a ball out of the tube by pinching. So if I want to throw the top ball, I can squeeze the second one, and then to throw that one, I can squeeze the bottom one. To get a good throw, you want to hold near the bottom of the tube, and it's like you're pushing it up and out and then quickly pulling back down. I've seen people struggle with that motion and the idea of the pinching thing, so I didn't want to just skip by it, but with that out of the way, we can get into some actual juggling. Every form of juggling has its own base pattern, whether or not that's a 3-ball cascade that you're probably used to, or whatever this is with ping pong balls. I did a whole video on that, by the way, links in the description if you're interested. Anyway, this is the base pattern for the tennis balls, and it's basically a normal cascade, but one hand becomes a tube. Before you can move on to anything else, you want to be very comfortable just doing this pattern. The tube may end up in the other hand for some tricks, so it can be helpful to drill this on both sides, but I know I'm definitely guilty of skipping out on my left hand training, so I get it. If you're feeling confident with this pattern though, we can get into a few tricks now. The most basic trick that you can do is just tossing the whole tube to the other hand instead of throwing just the ball. You can try and keep it upright, but it's generally easier to just give the whole thing a flip. The next step up on this pattern is where you throw 2 balls, but then pass the tube to the other hand, and throw the 2 balls back and pass again. You can actually do this with any object, and I've generally done it with like bigger things, but it works well with the tennis ball juggling, and it's a good way to break up your patterns. Moving on to multiplexing, this is my favorite, and I think it's the most important thing to learn for this, because it looks really cool, but the tube is doing all of the work. If you give it a flip while there's 2 balls in there, 1 ball will fall out every single time. You don't need to do anything special, it just happens. And it's great. That never works out like that with anything else. This is also one of my favorite ways to start juggling tennis balls, because if you grab the tube by the top with all 3 in there and give it a flip, 2 of them fall out, fairly evenly spaced. You can grab those and start juggling from that. You have to be kind of quick, but again, you don't really need to do anything special. They just fall out the right way every time. Alright, moving on. Another thing to remember is that the tube itself is a 4th object that you have in your hands, which means that you have the option to just ditch it mid-pattern and go into some regular 3-ball tricks, or, in a much more interesting and much more difficult option, you can break into a 4-ball pattern. This is really difficult because the tube doesn't flip super well, and the weighting is completely different from the tennis balls. So I personally will normally only do this for 1 or 2 throws and then get back to normal. But again, it is an option and it's something you can drill if you're really into that. There's also something I've been wanting to do more where you can take the ball and you can catch it on the back of the tube. And the problem with this is that most tennis ball tubes have those like little feet on them. And so it's not impossible, but it makes it very difficult to catch it on the back of that thing. So if you can find a concave divoted tennis ball tube, definitely get that, because that'll let you do so many more tricks. Actually, now that I'm thinking about it, I could just make a part to go on the bottom of the... I'm gonna take a brief break and do some design stuff. I had no idea how valuable a 3D printer would be for a juggler, but this thing is so useful. I actually have a whole project with this stuff coming up, but that's a different video. So for now, I grabbed this thing, stuck a bunch of hot glue in there, and then slapped it on the end of the tube. I hadn't really done much with this before since it's so difficult, so I just took some time to play around here. And I think the best way to really do this is just with the two balls. It gives you a little more wiggle room to take your time and do the stalls. And I think there's a really cool one with just flipping the tube upside down and letting one ball fall out when you stall the next one. I don't know, I like how that looks. But this is definitely something that has even more potential than what I'm getting into right now. Alright, that's all I got for you today. Hopefully you learned something. I would totally recommend giving this a shot. It's a ton of fun, and it's not something you see very often, so it's a good, unique way to get more into juggling. If you liked what you saw, make sure to let me know, and I will see you in the next one.